She knocked on the heavy oak door of the ranch house with calloused hands and her head held high. She didn't come hat in hand, nor did she arrive with teary eyes begging for pity. She stood there with the straight-backed posture of someone who learned from the cradle that dignity is not up for negotiation, not even when your stomach aches from hunger and the world insists on reminding you of how small you are. She did what any self-respecting mother would do. She put her kids ahead of her own pride, took a deep breath, and went looking for what was hers by right. She wasn't asking for a handout or a favor. She was asking for an honest day's work, paid with the same respect owed to any other human being. What she didn't know, on that crisp October morning smelling of wet sweetgrass and red Texas dirt, was that the man behind that heavy door carried a secret that would alter the course of both their lives forever. Because sometimes, destiny doesn't knock before it decides to do something wonderful. This is a fictional story, created for your entertainment, but deeply inspired by that American heartland we all know by heart. The unmistakable scent of rain on dry plains after a summer thunderstorm, the lowing of cattle at dusk when the sun lazily dips behind the rolling hills, the whispered secrets on the church steps after Sunday service, and the small-town gossip that is born at the diner counter and crosses the county line long before lunchtime. It's a story about what happens when false pride meets true humility, when wealth goes toe-to-toe with character, and when life decides, in the most unexpected way, to take justice into its own hands, without lawyers, without grand speeches, and without warning. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit that button right now. Every Sunday we have a brand new story waiting for you, and I promise you, this is one of the best we've ever told. The year was 1978, and the small county of Oakhaven, deep in the Texas Hill Country, moved at that slow, deliberate pace that rural towns manage to maintain even when the rest of the world is rushing by. The roads were still mostly red dirt, that stubborn dust that kicked up with the wind, settled into your boots, and stained the hems of your jeans as concrete proof that you belonged to that soil, that you were as rooted to the land as the wild pecan trees nobody planted, but that bloomed every year regardless. The ranches were scattered across the plains like islands of prosperity, surrounded by golden pastures and an endless blue sky that stretched into forever. But among them all, one stood out from miles away, long before you even reached the main gate: the Ironwood Ranch. Its pastures were immaculate. The Angus cattle were fat and sleek, and the sweeping wraparound porch was swept clean every single morning with the care of someone expecting an imminent, highly important guest. Benjamin Vance, or Mr. Ben, as everyone called him behind his back, from the lowliest ranch hand to the county judge when he needed a favor, owned more acres of land than most folks would ever step foot on in a lifetime. He had inherited the property from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather. Over the years, Ben had expanded the estate through a relentless mix of hard work, waking up before the sun, and a sharp business acumen that the town elders praised aloud and the younger men envied in bitter silence. At 42, he was undoubtedly the wealthiest man in the county. He owned purebred cattle brought in from the Midwest, vast fields of soybeans that were just starting to show promise as the next big cash crop, and a massive homestead boasting a wide timber deck with views of the most breathtaking sunsets the state had to offer. The kind of sunsets that force you to stop and stare without knowing why, as if the sky were collecting an old debt of admiration. But there was one thing Ben Vance didn't have, and that all his money, try as he might, seemed entirely incapable of buying: the certainty that the people around him were there for who he was as a man, and not for the size of his bank account. He had been married once in his youth, to the daughter of a neighboring landowner. It was an arrangement brokered by their families under the cold logic of merging property lines, where love was considered a rare luxury rather than a requirement. That marriage survived 7 years of icy politeness until the woman packed her bags and ran off with an agricultural equipment rep from Dallas who had come to sell tractors and left with much more than a sales contract. Along with her went the few remaining illusions Ben held about finding genuine affection in a world where everything had a price tag and everything was negotiable. Since then, distrust had taken root in his chest like weeds in fertile soil, deep, silent, and impossible to pull out without damaging everything around it. He learned to operate within that armor. He built an efficient, orderly life around that void. But a void is still an empty hole, no matter how many cattle graze around it. In October of '78, when Clara Hayes knocked on his door with her 2 kids clutching her skirt and a plastic folder of documents pressed to her chest, Ben Vance was at exactly the point a smart, lonely man reaches when he's tired of waiting and decides to take action. He was ready to test before trusting, to observe from the shadows before feeling, to test the waters before diving in. He knew it was a cold, calculating method, but it was the only shield he had left to keep from getting hurt again. Clara was 36 years old and had 2 reasons to keep breathing. Tommy, 11, who had been born with a perpetual frown of seriousness, as if he'd been delivered with an inherent concern for the state of the global economy. And little Gracie, 8, who balanced out her brother's gravity by being the most cheerful, talkative, and curious creature the neighborhood had seen in decades. Clara's husband, Robert, had died tragically 2 years earlier in an accident at the local lumber mill. A transmission belt had snapped at the worst possible moment, a split-second fatal mishap on a Monday afternoon that seemed like any other, and just like that, it was over. The man who provided for that family, who had slept beside Clara for 13 years, who knew exactly how she liked her coffee, was gone faster than a proper goodbye. No warning. No time to say what mattered. The lumber company paid out a settlement that looked like a fortune the day the check was handed over, but it evaporated with the cruel speed money has when it's forced to bear the weight and hunger of an entire family. It lasted barely 4 months. Clara's mother-in-law, a woman who boasted of her church attendance but practiced very little Christian charity at home, had offered them a drafty trailer at the back of her lot. In practice, it was emotional servitude disguised as family generosity. She gave them a roof, sure, but Clara had to practically bow in gratitude every morning for the huge favor, and gratitude extracted in daily installments of humiliation eventually weighs far more than any monthly rent. Clara wasn't the type to sulk in corners. It wasn't that she didn't hurt. She hurt down to her bones, with the silent intensity of someone who bites her pillow crying at 2 a.m. so as not to wake her children. But she had learned an invaluable lesson from her own mother, who raised 6 kids breaking her back taking in laundry, and who never let them miss a meal or lose their dignity. Crying doesn't put food on the table, and the world isn't going to stop spinning to wait for your grief to pass. So Clara did whatever it took. She scrubbed floors for the wealthy families in town. She weeded Mrs. Higgins's garden in exchange for fresh squash and the occasional live chicken. She baked pies and sold them outside the elementary school when she had the ingredients and the energy to do both. However, the rent for the tiny shotgun house she managed to get after her relationship with her mother-in-law permanently exploded, right after the old bat casually mentioned that a widow's children were a cross God gave her to bear for some hidden sin, was choking her like a noose. On that Tuesday morning, Clara woke up with the cold, absolute clarity of someone who has hit a brick wall. Either she found a steady job with regular pay, or she'd have to pull her kids out of school and move back to the dirt-poor farming town she'd left with so much hope years ago. It was Doris, the loudmouth who ran the register at the local butcher shop, who spilled the news. While wrapping a pound of chuck roast in butcher paper with the speed of a 20-year veteran, she mentioned that the Ironwood Ranch was desperate for live-in help at the main house. The older couple who used to manage the place, Mac and Rosie, had quit the month before to move to Houston to follow their youngest son, drawn by the boom of city jobs. Mr. Ben had been weeks without anyone trustworthy to run the kitchen and maintain a house that was an untamable beast if left unattended. Clara didn't sleep a wink that night, weighing the pros and cons with the gravity of a judge issuing a verdict. There was no margin for error. Moving to the ranch meant taking her kids with her. She had no one to leave them with, and even if she did, she wouldn't, because her children weren't luggage to be checked. It meant moving away from town, from the clinic, from the school the kids knew. Above all, it meant stepping into the daily life of a powerful private man she barely knew by sight, about whom there were plenty of rumors, and having to trust that the few good things people said about him were enough to justify such a massive decision. But at dawn, when she opened the pantry and found a single can of baked beans and a handful of rice, realizing with stark terror that after that meal there was absolutely nothing left for tomorrow. The decision overtook her with the pragmatic ruthlessness of someone who cannot afford to hesitate. She gathered her papers, combed the kids' hair, hitched a ride with a delivery truck driver heading that way, and off they went. The massive wrought-iron gates of the Ironwood Ranch were wide open when they arrived. Ben Vance wasn't a man to shut his gates on anyone arriving with decent intentions. Tommy and Gracie walked on either side of their mother, who held her manila folder tight against her chest. The children's wide eyes scanned every detail, the cattle grazing in the distance, the large barns, the old live oak trees lining the driveway, their thick roots cracking the asphalt as if the earth wanted to remind everyone who was really in charge. The truck driver honked his horn in farewell and pulled away, leaving a thick cloud of red dust that took forever to settle. The main house stood at the end of the tree-lined drive. It was an imposing structure, with a high-pitched roof, a deep wraparound porch supported by thick columns, painted a crisp white with dark green wooden shutters that the merciless Texas sun had slowly faded over time. The house radiated that unmistakable aura of places that have witnessed a lot of history, a slightly weary dignity, a solidity that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. It was Ben Vance himself who answered the door, since without staff, there was no other option. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, a fact that neither his worn denim work jeans nor his rolled-up plaid shirt could hide. His face was permanently tanned from the plain sun, and he wore an unreadable expression. Not hostile, but not overly friendly either. It was the calculating gaze of a man who measures twice before cutting once. Seeing a woman accompanied by children, he instinctively removed his Stetson, an automatic gesture betraying the good upbringing a Southern boy learns early and never forgets. The rancher observed them in silence for a few seconds that felt much longer. He glanced down at the folder Clara held out firmly, gripped with both hands like an ambassador presenting her credentials, and then locked eyes with her. "I'm here about the job," Clara said. Her voice was clear, unwavering, holding his gaze without a trace of that nervous, servile smile people often fake when they desperately need a favor. "Doris down at the butcher shop told me you were looking for someone to run the house." Ben took a step to the side, gesturing for them to come up. "Come on up. You can sit on the porch." He settled into a weathered wicker rocking chair that groaned under his weight and began thumbing through her papers without rushing. Clara remained standing. Gracie was far too amazed to sit. The little girl had locked her attention onto a massive tabby cat sleeping peacefully on the porch railing, radiating that majestic arrogance of felines who know they own the property. "Do you have experience running a ranch house this size?" Ben asked, not taking his eyes off the documents. "I have experience working my fingers to the bone," Clara replied, and there was a very deliberate edge to that answer. It wasn't insolence, it was absolute precision. "I cook well, I leave floors shining, and I can tend a vegetable garden if need be. I've never left a job half done in my life. And these kids, they're my children. They go wherever I go." There was something in the tone of her voice. She wasn't asking for permission. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't up for debate. It was an unmovable, established fact. That poise made Ben lift his head from the papers and look at her with an entirely different level of attention. "I don't see a problem with that," the man stated, after a pause that didn't denote annoyance, but rather quiet analysis. "There's a large, cool room right behind the kitchen. It'll fit the three of you perfectly. Can you start Monday? If you need me, I can start tomorrow at sunrise." The corners of the rancher's mouth twitched into what was almost a smile. Anyone who didn't know him wouldn't have noticed, but the intention was there. "Monday is fine." What Clara Hayes was completely unaware of, and would take quite some time to discover, was that Ben Vance had made a decision during the final weeks of September that even he found hard to justify out loud without feeling like a crazy old fool. He had decided, for the first and only time in his life, to run a social experiment. And it wasn't about testing Clara, because she hadn't even crossed his radar yet. The experiment was aimed at the world around him, at the hypocritical town that bowed and scraped and rolled out the red carpet for him from the day he inherited his first acre. He was viscerally sick of not knowing whether the people buzzing around him wanted his company or his wallet. if they craved his friendship or his influence at the county courthouse to fix their messes. The season for the annual county summer jamboree was approaching. Usually, the wealthier ranchers would host their own massive barbecues that weekend. Brisket, cold beer, fireworks, and that specific brand of Southern networking where big deals are sealed over bourbon on the back porch. But Ben had sent word to the town that there would be no party at Ironwood this year. The official excuse was that he was still mourning the sudden passing of his old friend Harlan, who had dropped dead of a massive heart attack in July. Dragging out the mourning period wasn't the noblest excuse, he knew, but it was the perfect trench to avoid interrogations. However, down at the town square, the mayor was throwing a massive public fair, free entry, open to everyone in Oakhaven and the neighboring counties. Ben Vance had resolved to attend that fair in a way that would freeze the blood of anyone who knew him. He left his expensive beaver felt Stetson on the rack, took off the solid gold Rolex his father gave him for his 30th birthday, and left his brand-new Ford F-250, which was practically his rolling business card, parked in the barn. Dressed in faded, no-name jeans, scuffed work boots, and a cheap plain cotton shirt he'd bought specifically for this at the local discount store, Ben was going to dive into the fair's sea of humanity as just another blue-collar worker. His goal was simple: to observe from absolute anonymity how his friends treated a man who displayed zero signs of wealth or power. He had run smaller test trials before, just to see if his theory held water or if he was just getting paranoid. A couple of months prior, he rode an old, rusty bicycle into town wearing rags and walked into the finest Western wear store on Main Street. He timed it. He stood there like a ghost for exactly 32 minutes. During that time, he watched the store clerk walk past him multiple times, completely ignoring him, while rushing to kiss the boots of any customer who parked outside in a late-model car. It was a minor detail in the grand scheme of things, but it had driven a needle of deep disappointment straight into his pride. On the night of the jamboree, Ben arrived at the town square while the sun was still painting the rooftops orange. He bought a plastic cup of ice-cold sweet tea and leaned against the trunk of a massive oak tree, blending into the crowd. A local country bluegrass band was playing on the gazebo, the twang of the banjo and the thump of the upright bass bouncing through the thick, humid night air. The kind of music you can't listen to without tapping your foot. The air was thick with the smell of smoked brisket, fried funnel cakes, and the unmistakable sulfur scent of firecrackers that kids were setting off way too close to the food stands, with that suicidal recklessness that is the exclusive property of childhood. Strings of Edison bulbs cast a warm, trembling light over sweaty, happy faces, giving the scene a magical quality that hid the daily miseries of working-class life. It didn't take long for the first familiar faces to appear. Tammy, the vain daughter of City Councilman Higgins, the same girl who had spent 2 years orchestrating accidental run-ins after Sunday service trying to snag the wealthy widower, walked right past him, not 3 feet away. She didn't even blink in his direction. Her eyes scanned the plaza, taking a superficial inventory of who was worth greeting and who should be ignored. Later, Earl showed up. Earl was the sycophant who owned the gas station on the highway. This was the same Earl who, whenever he saw Ben's shiny truck pulling in, would sprint out of his office grinning ear to ear like he'd just seen Jesus. Well, Earl brushed right past Ben's shoulder and didn't even utter a good evening. Without the truck and the expensive clothes, Earl's social radar simply classified Ben as invisible trash. A while later, he spotted Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, a local high society vulture who, without a doubt, would be at the gates of his ranch next Monday, begging Ben to make a call to the bank manager to stop a foreclosure on her husband's land. At the fair, Eleanor was so busy parading her daughter in front of an out-of-towner who looked rich that she didn't have half a second of attention to waste on a poor dirt farmer in scuffed boots. Ben wasn't bitter about the snubs. He was logging every incident with the forensic coldness of an accountant auditing a ledger. Everything confirmed his darkest suspicions. It was the empirical evidence he had gone out to hunt for. It was exactly what he expected. The only existential doubt left in his soul was whether in the entire damn county there was a single exception to the rule. Was there one human being in this packed square capable of looking at a man stripped of his symbols of power and seeing simply a man? And it was then, while he was waiting in line to buy a second cup of sweet tea at a small stand away from the deafening noise of the band, that he saw her. Clara had arrived at the festival with Tommy and Gracie after leaving the ranch kitchen absolutely spotless. Even though they had agreed she'd start on Monday, she had shown up at the property on Friday. When she opened the massive pantry on Thursday to take a look, she found such a horrific disaster. Sacks of flour mixed with spilled beans and expired jars shoved to the back, that her nervous system simply wouldn't allow her to wait 3 more days to restore order. She had asked the boss for permission to take the kids to the fair for a bit on Saturday night, and Ben had told her, of course, it wasn't a prison, go have fun. He said it in the relaxed tone of a boss trying not to sound like a slave driver. At the square, Clara was wearing a simple blue cotton dress with little white flowers. She had starched and ironed it twice because the occasion called for it. Her dark hair was pulled into a thick braid over one shoulder. She radiated that beautiful, specific lightness that honest people carry when they go out after a week of hard labor, with the clean conscience of owing nothing to anyone. Tommy walked by her side, devouring a bag of roasted peanuts with the concentration of a general planning a battle. Gracie, in less than a heartbeat, had become best friends with another little girl, and the two were twirling near the gazebo with that magical, instant sisterhood that adults lose the moment they learn to distrust their neighbors. Ben was leaning against the wooden post of the drink stand when Clara walked up to buy 2 cups of lemonade for her kids. At first glance, she didn't recognize him. They had only been crossing paths for 3.5 days. He always came into the kitchen at the crack of dawn, hat pulled down low, muddy boots, looking like he'd been wrestling stubborn calves before his first sip of coffee. Without his rancher's gear, under the dim string lights of the fair, he was just a tall, middle-aged man in humble clothes. "Evening," Clara said, simply because she was raised with manners. "Good evening to you," he replied. By some twist of fate, right at that millisecond, the teenager running the stand accidentally knocked over the entire cooler of sweet tea. That meant neither customer was going anywhere for the next 5 minutes while the kid ran to the back to mix another batch. Those forced 5 minutes morphed into small talk, then into 40 minutes of deep conversation, and finally into something neither of them had budgeted for in their life plans. "Those your kids?" Ben asked, grabbing the most obvious topic to break the ice. "Yes, sir. My pride and joy," she answered, giving him that unmistakable mother's smile. Not a hollow, boastful grin, but that visceral look of love, from someone who knows those creatures are her whole world and is glad someone else noticed they exist. "The older boy looks like a bank manager, mighty serious for his age," he joked, watching Tommy, who had finished his peanuts and was now scanning the crowd with an analytical frown. Clara let out a laugh, a short, husky, genuine laugh. "That's my boy, all right. Been like that since he was in the crib. His daddy was exactly the same way, God rest his soul." She said it without putting on a soap opera drama, without fishing for easy tears or demanding the standard condolences society expects from widows. She said it with the serenity of a woman who had already chewed through her grief, who had cried all she needed to cry into her pillow at night, and who no longer needed an audience for her pain. The weight of that hit Ben with total clarity. He looked at her differently. "You from around Oakhaven?" she asked, reaching the crossroads where a conversation either politely dies or steps toward intimacy. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. He didn't plan to flat-out lie, but he had to ration the truth. "I'm from a little farm not far from here," he said, which was a half-truth, perfect for avoiding suspicion. "I'm a country girl myself, proud of it too," she stated, straightening her posture slightly, with the fierce pride of someone not ashamed to have dirt under her fingernails. "Before coming here, we lived in a little town out by the Panhandle. My daddy grew corn and pinto beans. We were poor as church mice, but that patch of dirt was ours." "And what do you do now?" "Well, I just got hired on full-time at a big ranch near here. Started working my tail off this week." There was a brutal, disarming transparency to Clara. It wasn't the naivety of a fool who doesn't know the evils of the world. It was the honesty of someone who sees the traps, knows the risks, but prefers not to waste breath pretending to be something she isn't. Ben realized, amazed, that she wasn't calculating her words. She wasn't trying to charm him, wasn't measuring the consequences of her chat. She was simply there, on a fair night in a dusty town, drinking lemonade and sharing stories with an unknown farmer. "And is the boss a decent man or a slave driver?" Ben asked, holding his breath. She pondered it with absolute seriousness. "Still figuring that out. Seems like a man of his word, real straight arrow. And I need something steady to keep food in my kids' mouths, so I'm gonna break my back and do my part, come hell or high water." He stayed quiet, struck by her. "In the end, that's the only thing a person can control, ain't it?" Ben finally said. "It's the only piece of the world that's 100% mine," she agreed, with a conviction that wasn't the resignation of a loser, but pure philosophy, forged by the hard knocks life had dealt her. They stood talking for much longer than good manners usually dictate. They talked about how hard it is to raise kids in the country versus the city, about how the plains look like a desert in a drought and a paradise after the first rains. They debated whether pinto beans yield better than black-eyed peas, and agreed that the sweet tea at this stand was watery, and the lady selling peach cobbler on the corner made the best dessert in the county. The band played a fast fiddle tune, then a two-step, and finally a country ballad so melancholic that an elderly couple next to them held each other close to dance, swaying with the complicit intimacy of old, enduring love. Tommy got bored of monitoring them and wandered off to watch the fireworks near the church. Gracie ran back to beg for $1 for cotton candy, scanned the man in the plain shirt with the ruthless X-ray vision only 8-year-old girls possess, and, detecting no threat, skipped back to her new friend. When sleep and exhaustion finally defeated the kids and they started tugging at Clara's dress to go home, she said goodbye with a polite, "Have a good night, sir. It was a real pleasure talking to you." She walked away down the cobblestone street, illuminated by colored bulbs, holding a child in each hand. She didn't look back, didn't ask for a name, didn't leave an address. She didn't try to force fate. Ben stood paralyzed by the drink stand, gripping his empty plastic cup, watching her silhouette disappear into the crowd. He felt something strange in the center of his chest that took minutes to decode. An emotional muscle atrophied from lack of use. It was the feeling of being completely disarmed. He had dropped his guard. He had spoken without calculating, without suspecting, without having to protect his wallet. It happened on its own, and that terrified and fascinated him all at once. On Monday, with the first crow of the rooster, Ben walked down to the massive kitchen at 6:30, as his lifelong routine dictated. The scene he found jolted his senses. The unmistakable aroma of strong, freshly brewed drip coffee filled the room. A pan of buttermilk biscuits was rising in the oven. The giant oak farm table was not just clean, it gleamed with an obsessive level of care that indicated the person in charge didn't just wipe away dirt, but commanded respect. Clara was facing away, vigorously stirring a cast-iron skillet on the stove. The kids were still sleeping, getting ready for their first day at the local school that Ben had helped arrange. He stood frozen in the doorway. She didn't notice his presence until he took a heavy step on the hardwood floor. When she turned around, Clara's face was a theater in fast forward. First confusion, then mental gears turning a mile a minute, then the crushing blow of realization, and finally, an unreadable expression, but one that definitely was not servile panic. "Sir, you," Clara stammered, stopping cold. Some truths need a few seconds to settle on the tongue. "Have a seat for a second, Clara," he said, pulling out a rustic chair for himself. "Let me explain." She didn't sit. She stood as rigid as a fence post, gripping her wooden spoon so tight her knuckles turned white. Her eyes took on the hard, brilliant glare of someone preparing to spit an uncomfortable truth, knowing it might cost her dearly, but preferring the street over being made a fool. "You were playing dress-up at the fair, hiding on purpose," she fired off. "Yes, I was. And for what reason, if I might ask?" There was no hysteria or tantrum in her tone. It was a clear, unvarnished demand for an accounting. The exact toll exacted by a person with dignity when they feel their intelligence has been played with behind their back. Ben rubbed his face with both hands. He was about to do something unprecedented, confess his weaknesses to a virtual stranger. "Look, Clara, "I have a serious problem figuring out who is who in this life," he began, chewing on every syllable. "In this town, because of the ranch and the money I have, people crawl, they kiss my boots, and they show me a face that is pure fake. I was sick to my stomach over it. I wanted to see with my own eyes how folks treat a neighbor when there ain't a dime involved. And what did you find out with your little game? I found out that the pack of hypocrites in Oakhaven are exactly who I thought they were." A heavy silence fell, thick as molasses. "But I also found out that there are exceptions," he finished, looking her dead in the eye. The ensuing silence hung by a thread. It could break toward disaster or redemption. Clara held the rancher's gaze without blinking for a long minute. Then, with a calm that wasn't submission, but the acceptance that the playing field was level again, she turned back to the stove. "Coffee's hot, boss," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Biscuits will be out of the oven in 5 minutes. Make yourself comfortable." He understood the coded message. She accepted the unspoken apology, the employment contract still stood, and the rules of the game had just changed forever. Ben sat at the table, listening to the crackle of the stove and the chatter of mockingbirds in the pecan trees outside. For the first time in decades, he felt the absolute blessed certainty of being exactly in the right place. October gave way to November, bringing late afternoon downpours that washed the dust away and dressed the plains in vibrant emerald. November slipped into December, and the Ironwood Ranch began to pulse again, regaining that warmth of home that grand houses lose when loneliness takes up residence. Clara proved to be as methodical and perfectionist as she had warned. She transformed the ruined vegetable patch out back into an orderly garden. She planted cilantro, jalapeno peppers, beefsteak tomatoes, and a lemon tree she guarded like a third child. The kitchen smelled heavenly from dawn till dusk. Clara cooked with the ancient seasoning of country women, the kind who understand that a hot plate of food is love made material in a bite. Ben, without realizing it, established a new religion. Drinking his afternoon coffee on the back porch, facing the garden, watching the hummingbirds fight over the blossoms. Clara, sometimes, would sit on the edge of the stone steps to rest for a moment while the rice simmered. The conversations between them began to sprout like wildflowers, unforced, making their own way. They talked about crop blights, about how Tommy had grilled him with questions about cattle breeds, about the difference between baking a pie with lard versus butter. They were trivial conversations that, brick by brick, built the X-ray of two adult souls, battered by life, discovering the immense pleasure of keeping each other company. For Tommy, the ranch was the earthly paradise his grandmother's drafty trailer never gave him. Ben, who had no heirs and believed himself awkward around kids, discovered in the serious boy a fascinating apprentice, thirsty to know how to calculate a calf's weight or why dark soil was better for planting than red. He started putting Tommy up on his horse or in the truck on weekends to check the pastures. They shared long, comfortable silences in the brush, a masculine camaraderie that healed old wounds in Ben he didn't even know were bleeding. For her part, little Gracie was already the lord and master of the giant tabby cat, whom she named Tiger. The animal followed her like a guard dog in that silent transactional agreement cats make when they find the perfect human who knows exactly where to scratch their head. It was a perfect ecosystem that formed without blueprints or contracts, with the fluidity of a river finding its natural bed. But outside the stone walls of the ranch, the town of Oakhaven was boiling. The rural American South in the late 70s was unforgiving, and other people's lives were the national sport par excellence, especially if there was money, widowhood, and an eligible bachelor involved. When the gossip spread that Mr. Ben had moved a poor, out-of-town widow with kids into his house, news that took less than 48 hours to circle the town square thanks to the tireless diplomatic work of Doris the Butcher, the vipers sharpened their fangs. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, the matron who had invested 3 years in war strategies to get her daughter Charlene into Ben's bed, was the first to distill the venom. "Oh, Lord have mercy! A starving little widow from the streets, sleeping under the same roof as the richest man in the county. It doesn't take a genius to figure out how that shameless hussy is paying her rent," the woman declared, adjusting her pearls after the 12 o'clock Sunday service. She said it at a low volume, but calibrated with satellite precision so the key gossips would hear, knowing the seed of slander would sprout quickly. Charlene, the daughter in question, was 28, boasted of having gone to a finishing school in Georgia, and was a specialist in the wicked art of delivering stab wounds hidden inside phrases of pious concern. "Bless Mr. Ben's heart," the girl sighed, with a tone of fake pity. "He must be so desperate for a little company, so vulnerable, poor thing, that any gold-digging tramp can play him for a fool." Earl, the gas station attendant, the same insect who had ignored Ben at the summer fair, suddenly became a moral expert at the local tavern. "Look, I ain't one to judge, but a single woman nobody knows shacked up at night with a rich widower out in the country. I mean, we weren't born yesterday, were we?" Clara wasn't deaf. She heard the snide remarks when she went to the grocer, when she picked the kids up at the public elementary school, when she stood in line at the bank. She felt that invisible chill on her skin, the averted gaze, the tight smile that didn't reach the eyes, the forced greeting. It wasn't a new movie for her. It was the exact same witch hunt she suffered when she was widowed and her husband's friends' wives started giving her the cold shoulder, terrified that widowhood came with an uncontrollable urge to steal other women's husbands. Clara applied her old, reliable antidote. She kept her eyes glued to her chores, kept her kids scrubbed clean and well-mannered, and kept her spine as rigid as a steel mast. It was the only impenetrable fortress she controlled. Ben found out about the rumors through Doris herself, who justified the report not as gossip, but as a courtesy heads-up. Doris told him that when she warned Clara about the town's wagging tongues, the widow grabbed her grocery bags, dropped her change in her purse, and declared, "Let the dogs bark. It means we're moving forward." She said it without an ounce of venom or drama, and walked out with her usual unflappable stride. When Ben heard that story, the stoic resilience, the total absence of victimhood, something heavy and rusted broke loose from the bottom of his soul. He reached the enlightenment of wise men. Clara Hayes was an invaluable gem. Not because she was submissive or perfect. Lord, no, she was stubborn as a mule. She had ironclad opinions on how to run a household and wouldn't bite her tongue to correct the boss if she saw something done wrong, which was annoying, but at the same time fascinating and necessary. Clara was a woman cut from one solid piece of cloth. What you saw on the outside was exactly what she was stuffed with on the inside. No masks, no false bottoms. And that kind of timber, the rich rancher knew full well at the cost of his own loneliness, was scarcer than clean water in a drought. March arrived, bringing a warm spring night where the crickets put on a deafening concert. They had been under the same roof for nearly 5 months. After supper, they were both sitting on the front porch. An old transistor radio was playing a country broadcast that neither of them was really listening to. The kids were already snoring in their room. The thick country breeze carried the intoxicating scent of night-blooming jasmine and orange blossoms. In the distance, fireflies blinked in the tall grass. With a sharp motion, Ben clicked the radio off. The snap cut the air. A dense silence fell. "Clara!" he called out. She peeled her eyes away from Tommy's school trousers, which she was darning after he tore them on barbed wire. "I got something stuck in my craw that I need to say," the man continued, his voice low, "and I'm asking you as a favor to hear me all the way out before you answer a word." Clara lowered her hands, let the needle rest on the fabric in her lap, and stared at him. She prepared to listen with the sacred attention of someone who knows words matter. And Ben spilled his guts. He vomited up the story of his ruinous first marriage, the betrayal, and the armor of ice he built afterward, the experiment at the jamboree, what he went out looking for, and the incalculable treasure he found without seeking it. He made it crystal clear that he wasn't demanding anything she didn't want to give of her own free will. That if her answer was a flat no, everything would stay exactly the same. She would keep her job and her roof intact, and he would never bother her again. That the respect and deep admiration he felt for her as a woman and a mother was bulletproof against any romantic rejection. He fell silent, hollowed out inside, exposed and vulnerable, something the great Ben Vance had never experienced in his life. Clara stared out into the blackness of the pastures for an eternity. Her face was a hieroglyph. There was no disgust or rejection, but her eyes reflected the cornered panic of an animal that survived a steel trap, knowing the heart is soft meat that bleeds out if handed to the wrong hunter. "Mr. Ben, you are a good man," she finally said, measuring her words as if they weighed gold. "But there's something you need to burn into your brain. I walked through that door asking for work to feed my kids. I didn't come looking for a husband to keep me, or a rich rancher to rescue me from poverty, or a fake daddy for my children. I came for honest work." "I know," he cut in, "and you have it here, and you always will." "Then let me think on it. Let me swallow this." He nodded slowly, pushed himself up from the rocking chair, and retreated to his quarters without pressing her, a gesture she valued to her core. Clara stayed on the porch for another full hour, lulled by the hoarse croak of the bullfrogs and the distant hoot of an owl. She thought of Tommy and Gracie. She thought of the paralyzing terror of reopening the door to her intimacy to a man after believing she had buried that part of her life next to Robert's casket in the graveyard. She thought that fear, ultimately, is a survival alarm, but sometimes that alarm doesn't scream that something is a deadly threat. It warns you that something is dangerously real. At dawn, Clara served him his steaming coffee, as she did every blessed morning, with astonishing normalcy. There wasn't a speck of tension in the air. But just as Ben pushed his chair back to stand up from the table, she spoke, without even turning to look at him as she scrubbed a skillet in the sink. "If this is going to move forward, boss, I'm laying down my rules. I need you to always speak the truth to me. Straight shooting, right to my face. Don't ever hide information to protect me. Don't make any decisions that splash on me or my kids without asking me first. And above all else, treat my children with the exact same respect you'd show the biggest rancher in this state." Ben squared his shoulders behind his chair, gripping the backrest with his large hands. "I give you my word as a man." "Done. In that case, we can keep talking, Ben." That was the roughest, most grounded and beautifully honest start to a courtship those timber walls had ever remembered. When the Vipers of Oakhaven realized this was dead serious, that it wasn't the passing fling or the boss's midlife crisis Mrs. Sterling preached about, but a solid relationship marching toward the altar, the dirty war escalated to absurd levels. Charlene, pushed by her furious mother, started visiting the ranch under the most ridiculously creative pretexts. Her father needed Ben's signature for a county permit. The Historical Society needed a donation. The local reverend was asking for funds to paint the steeple. The true objective of these invasions was to strut in front of Ben, to remind him there were refined, available society women far more suited to his status. Clara, armed with monumental patience, received them in the foyer, offered them coffee and shortbread cookies, and faced them with flawless cordiality, devoid of jealousy or sarcasm. The widow's confidence was a fortress of granite. She showed not a single scratch of insecurity before the snobby aristocrats. She simply existed, taking up her space with such poise that Charlene and her mother ended up fleeing, frustrated at finding not a single crack to inject their venom. August of '79 arrived. Oakhaven was celebrating its 60th anniversary, and the town council pulled out all the stops. They hired a famous country band from Austin, strung bunting across every street feeding into the square, set up barbecue and pie stands, and scheduled a pompous ceremony to honor the illustrious pillars of the community, which in plain English meant pinning medals on the rich folks to keep them happy. As expected, Ben was the guest of honor at the main table. But this time, the rancher made it crystal clear to the mayor, in a tone of command rather than suggestion, that he would be bringing a +1. The news flew, souring Mrs. Sterling's lunch and Charlene's dinner. Days before, Ben had taken Clara to an exclusive boutique in Dallas during a business trip. She picked out an emerald green dress with a modest cut, no flashy sequins or loud patterns, the kind of dress that shines through the elegance of its drape and requires no gaudy necklaces. Gracie, acting as her image consultant with the ruthless aesthetic honesty of 9-year-old girls, decreed her mother looked like a genuine queen. The night of the grand gala, when they crossed the square illuminated by hundreds of yellow bulbs, the world seemed to stop spinning. Ben wore a light linen suit he carried with the swagger of a classic movie star. Clara walked on his arm in the emerald dress, shoulders back, with her usual regal bearing. Tommy marched with a furrowed brow, stuffed into dark dress slacks and a starched white shirt, and little Gracie skipped along with a giant blue bow in her hair, hugging a ratty stuffed cat to her chest. A chilling silence fell over the square. The crowd went mute, as if struck by lightning. Mrs. Sterling, gossiping by the entrance with the notary's wife, nearly choked on her own saliva. Her face morphed from absolute disbelief to sulphuric envy, ending in a plastic grimace to hide her rage. Charlene, standing a few feet away, stared at the cobblestones for 10 agonizing seconds to keep from bursting into furious tears. During the official speeches, the mayor invited Ben to the microphone for a few words. He had never been a man of speeches, he hated politicking, was a man of action, and the whole town knew it. But Ben had spent weeks mentally rehearsing what he was going to say. It was stuck in his throat, and he needed to spit it out. He dryly thanked the town council, congratulated the county, and remembered the farmers who forged that land. And then, sweeping his gaze across the crowd and locking eyes on the table where the aristocratic families cowered, he declared with a voice like thunder, "Today, I want to give a very special thanks to my partner, Clara. A woman who walked through the gates of my ranch one fine day, asking for work to feed her kids, not begging for handouts. A woman who, without meaning to, slapped my conscience awake, teaching me that the decency and integrity of a human being are worth infinitely more than any pile of cash a man can flash or inherit. Anyone with eyes in their head can see that and learn from it. And the pack of envious folks who refuse to see it, well, that's on them and their poverty of spirit, and there ain't a bank in the world that can cure that." The silence that buried the square was the kind that chills you to the bone. Ben Vance had just delivered a slap of reality impossible to dodge. The mayor, sweating cold, started to clap. Slowly, the real ranchers and the working-class townsfolk joined in a thunderous standing ovation. The stiff pillars of the community swallowed their pride in a humiliating mute shock. At the head table, Clara's cheeks burned. It wasn't embarrassment. It was the emotional tidal wave of knowing the man she loved had just placed her on a pedestal in front of the entire town, giving her her rightful place against the wolves. Tommy, sitting very formally beside her, nudged her arm. "He made you blush, Mama." And Gracie, not blinking at the stage, stated wisely, "She's blushing, 'cause Mr. Ben spoke real pretty, didn't he?" Yes, he certainly did. Barely 3 weeks passed. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon. The kids were down by the creek chasing frogs with the foreman's children. Ben dropped into the rocking chair next to Clara on the back porch, reached into his jeans pocket, and pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden box. He offered it to her. She looked at the object and looked at him. "Don't panic. It ain't a wedding ring," he preempted, guessing her thoughts. "That ring business will come the day you feel like accepting it, if that day ever comes. This is a very different matter." "Open it!" Clara lifted the lid. Resting on a faded piece of velvet was a heavy, antique forged iron key tied with a worn yellow ribbon. "It's the master key to the office and my safe," the rancher explained, his voice raspy. "In there are the deeds to the ranch, the promissory notes, the checkbooks, my whole life. There ain't a duplicate of this key. I'm the only one who has it." He paused, swallowing hard. He knew the brutal weight of what he was handing over. "I want you to carry it, because it ain't fair for you to stand on this earth not knowing exactly what ground you're walking on. If we're sharing a life, you have a right to know exactly what is yours." Clara sat stunned, staring at the piece of cold iron resting on her palm. In that act of blind surrender, there was a declaration of love far more powerful and sacred than 100 bouquets of red roses or a 10-carat diamond. It was the absolute language of pure trust, the kind given without signing contracts, without a safety net, without a parachute. The only valid way to love. "You are still a mighty complicated man, Ben Vance," she whispered, finally giving him a massive smile that lit up her eyes completely. "Life gave me some hard knocks to train me, darling." Clara closed her fingers, clutching the key tightly against her chest. You're gonna have to bear with me and give me time to unlearn the bad stuff and start believing I deserve to be happy again. It's been a long while since I felt this kind of peace." "I got all the time in the world, woman," he replied, resting a hand on her knee. "I got a whole ranch full of time, and I ain't in a damn rush to get anywhere if I ain't holding your hand." The wedding took place in May of 1980. It was a humble, beautifully authentic shindig at the old limestone chapel that Ben's great-grandfather had built by hand a century ago. That little church had never housed so many pure hearts per square foot. The preacher rode his bicycle over from town because he was a close friend of the groom and hated the pomp of chauffeured cars. The ranch hands and cooks put together the feast: massive pots of BBQ brisket, smoked sausage, cast-iron skillet cornbread, and bubbling peach cobbler. Ruling the main table was a towering 3-tier vanilla pound cake, baked by the bride herself, oozing with caramel and butter so intoxicating that guests' mouths watered the second they crossed the stone fence. Mrs. Sterling, the insufferable lead viper, had to swallow her venom and make an appearance. Skipping it would have been admitting total, crushing defeat. She sat in the back pew, clenching her jaw, and had the cynical nerve to shake the bride's hand in the receiving line, an ice-cold grip but preferable to her plastic smiles. Charlene, her daughter, faked a terrible migraine to stay home. She sent her poor father to deliver a cellophane-wrapped toaster, wearing the annoyed look of a poor sap sent to do the dirty work. On the other hand, Earl, the gas station guy, arrived early, loaded up on brisket, went back for thirds on the pound cake, and spent the entire afternoon enthusiastically chatting with Tommy about the virtues of John Deere diesel engines. In the decades that followed, the Ironwood Ranch flourished just like in its glory days. And I don't just mean the thousands of acres, the Angus cattle, or the giant soybean harvests, but the spiritual expansion a house undergoes when it transforms into a home with a soul. Tommy, the boy with the serious face, went off to Texas A&M to study agricultural engineering, funded by a scholarship he earned the hard way, backed by the hands-on knowledge he absorbed from Ben, the man who taught him to smell the dirt, to guess if good rain was coming. He returned with a college degree under his arm that made Ben cry out of pure, absolute fatherly pride. Gracie, unstoppable, went to a teacher's college and came back as a rural educator to teach at the town elementary school, just as she had declared at 8 years old, when kids know what they want to be and adults clumsily try to change them. And Clara Hayes? Well, Clara stayed exactly the same untamable lioness from that first day she knocked on the front door, a woman with her head held high, tireless hands that never shied away from hard work, and the rare spiritual clarity of someone who knows exactly what she's worth and refuses to let life pay her a single penny less. In this twisted world, there are too many folks who confuse dignity with arrogant pride. Those same people who think a poor man who refuses to beg is acting uppity, who judge a woman demanding respect and refusing to sell out to the highest bidder as difficult, or who accuse a wounded man of being cold and calculating just because he decides to study his friends closely before opening the door to his home. But there is a massive gap between someone who builds an armor out of bitter resentment and someone who protects themselves out of pure street smarts. That intuition life tattoos on you through hard knocks. When you learn to identify the difference, the way you judge others changes radically. Clara never asked for pity, because what she needed was dignified work, knowing full well that pity expires in a month, but respect armors you forever. For his part, Ben Vance didn't offer her scraps, because what he actually put on the table, starting that memorable morning with the drip coffee, was his entire life. Both had to row against the current to defeat their own ghosts and mistrust, armed only with the scars of their past, until they found themselves in that blind, magical, unpredictable spot neither was looking for, but upon arriving, instantly recognized as their true home. And all those miserable folks who stayed behind the stone wall, swallowing bile and chewing on gossip, ended up drowning in their own venom, which, at the end of the day, was the miserable company they themselves chose to cultivate. That's usually what happens to people who spend so much energy sticking their noses in other people's business, they forget to water their own grass until it withers away. How about you? Do you know someone cut from that cloth? One of those brave souls who were judged unfairly because of where they were born, their lack of money, or the clothes on their back, and who at the end of the day ended up proving they had more grit, more character, and a soul 1,000 times richer than their white-collar executioners. Let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to read your stories. And if this story moved something in your chest, if you made it this far and feel your time was well spent, give us a click and subscribe to the channel right now. It's totally free, and I guarantee that every week we upload a new story that will grab you and won't let you put your screen down. Seriously, you won't want to miss what we've got coming next week. This was a fictional story created with the sole purpose of entertaining and making you think. Any resemblance to real people, ranches, or real-life situations is purely and divinely coincidental. See you next time.